minutes long, and then we're gonna talk about some of the production challenges that we had, some of the choices that we made and why. And you can ask some questions if you'd like, based on what you've heard after we play the clips. But in a nutshell, yeah, Susan and I worked together down the street at Northern Light Productions and on Western Avenue right here. We just walked here from work. And this podcast came about because of a film that Northern Light had produced about the Boston Strangler called Confessions of the Boston Strangler, and it was produced for Investigation Discovery. I wasn't working at Northern Light at the time, Susan was, and I'll let you say a little something about that. Do you want to?
Yeah. So for those of you who have heard the Boston Strangler podcast, you'll note that there was a lot of great research that went into it. It's a really complicated story. And we had made a 2-hour special. So this idea of a Boston story, Northern Light has been trying to figure out how you can sell one-off documentaries in a market that doesn't want one-off documentaries. And we started sticking with Boston stories and became the Boston production company. So we did one on Whitey Bulger with Investigation ID, and then we did a 2-hour on the Boston Strangler. So we got an even bigger one. And when we were during the making of the film, we came across a story that nobody knew about the Boston Strangler. I mean, you guys know nothing about the Boston Strangler to begin with because it took place in 1962, and you probably weren't around then. But we, in addition to the things that most of us know about the Boston Strangler, we found out that there was a guy who a lot of people thought was the real Boston Strangler. And the story had never been told. He killed somebody in New York City during the summer of '62 when all these horrible, weird stranglings, 63 stranglings were going on, so old lady stranglings. And the guy was Kojak. So there was a whole series in the 70s and 80s, Kojak. Well, it was based on a real detective, and he believed that the real strangler was this guy, Charles Terry from Maine, who he had caught. They had caught him in New York. And just when they were gonna get him to confess to the strangling, the Boston strangling, the whole interview came to a halt. They had to get somebody there to record it, and the guy clammed up and never confessed. So he spent his whole life trying to convince everybody that he had found the real Boston Strangler. So that was our big story, and we were gonna go to Maine, and we were gonna track down Charles Terry and introduce this guy that nobody knew about. So that's how we pitched it to ID, and we were in the middle of making it, and what should happen, but 50 years later, we get called down to the police station, and they announced that they found the this DNA of Albert DeSalvo, and suddenly Albert DeSalvo is the guy who did the last murder, so they wanted a film about Albert DeSalvo. And they wanted we needed to lose 20 minutes, so we cut out the whole thing about Charles Terry. It just didn't ever make it into the film. So I was really destroyed because Brian Kavanaugh, the son of this detective Kavanaugh, really wanted us to make this film. So ID said, well, you guys can make a podcast. There's this new thing, Serial just came out, there's this new thing called a podcast. And why don't you try and do it on Charles Terry instead in the podcast format? And so the team who had put together, we worked for like 2 years on The Strangler, knew everything about it, and got all these great contacts, but they all went off to do other projects. And we had to start all over again, and we needed the host. And Portland had walked through the door, and I'd given her some assignment to do. She wasn't even working for us. But she was a health expert, so I gave her, she was at her dentist, and I'm like, Portland, can you please correct this proposal I'm sending out? And she did. She said, okay, I'm in the lobby of my doctor's appointment, hang on. And she sent me a corrected proposal over her cell phone. And I said, okay, I'm hiring her. She had a great voice, and so Portland came on board. You've never done podcasts, right?
Well, actually, I
Kripalu.
had. Yeah, I work with Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health in Western Massachusetts, and probably from 2009 to 2016, I did a podcast for them, but completely different from this, like a 15-minute interview podcast where I would be interviewing experts who were going to be coming to teach there. So just a straight interview podcast, like really simple, nothing like this. So, and I'd done voiceover work for years, and I'm a trained actor, and I'd done producing and writing, so I had a lot of skills, but I'd never produced a podcast like this. This was hard, really hard.
We also our schedule. So Investigation ID Discovery gave us, I think, $25,000 to go out and make the pilot. And they said, you have to get an outside podcast producer because it's not the same as making documentary films, which we didn't know, but they were right, it's not the same. So we got this woman, Sharon, down in New York City, who worked with us, and we went out and made a trailer. And in the time that it took us to make the trailer, ID decided that they didn't really want to do podcasts. They didn't know how to monetize them. So there we were with our great pilot and our great story and nobody to make it. So that's when we just started calling people up and saying, we've got a great pilot, we've got a great story, and we started sending it around. And we found Midroll. They're two big companies that actually monetize these and sell advertising, and they put the Reverend John Delore. Do any of you know who the Reverend John Delore?
He was the sound designer on the podcast, and he was also one of the producers and writers, and he was just unbelievable.
Brilliant.
I mean, the reason it sounds so amazing is because of him.
And then put together this amazing team. We didn't know we needed an editor, really experienced, but we didn't know. And we had the people doing the research here. And so I think we fiddled around for the first couple of months.
It was basically like a 9-person team. So Susan was one of the executive producers, and then there was also an executive producer in New York City from Midroll. So there were 2 executive producers, and then I was a producer and writer. Sharon was a senior producer. There were 2 other writers, an editor, and then 2 researchers. So it was basically about 9 of us, but there were about 5 people writing this podcast. And I would just write the first draft. And then it would go to Sharon, who was the senior producer, and she would write the next draft. And then it would go to John and this guy Pete, and they would write the next drafts. And that first episode, if you ever listened to episode 1, there were 18 drafts of that first episode. By the time we got to the end, some of the final episodes, there were maybe 3 drafts, but it kind of we went from like 18 drafts, and the second episode there were maybe 16 drafts, and the third episode there were maybe 14 drafts, till we kind of were getting better at maybe doing it in like 3 drafts, but it's that hard. It's hard.
I forgot about the 18 drafts.
Yeah.
So that's what kind of took longer on the first one, and then
Yeah.
suddenly we're out of time.
Yeah.
So what was it, 2 weeks per show?
Yeah, 2 weeks per show.
2 weeks per show, and we're still trying to find people who, had been involved 50 years ago, which isn't an easy thing to do. So we're doing the reporting as we're doing it. But the Charles Terry story kind of got dropped along the way. Everybody just wants to tell the Boston Strangler, Murder of 13 Women story. So Charles Terry made it into 1 episode.
Made it into episode 5.
Episode 5, so I hope that was your favorite episode.
Susan's big on that one. So we want to move into the clips? Okay. So in telling this story, obviously we're telling a story of a sexual serial killer. And so often when you're telling these horrific stories, there's so much attention paid to the killer, but there's not a lot of attention paid to the victims. And what we wanted to try to do in the podcast is shine some light on who were these women, and not just sort of heroize Albert DeSalvo and other killers. So one of the challenges when you're telling a story that's from 1962 to 1964, the first 5 women that were killed were between 55 and 75 years of age. So people that knew them back then are also dead. So it's really hard to find people who knew these women to help describe who they were and bring them to life. But we were tasked with that challenge, and I was the one who often was having to call up these people. And with the first victim, Anna Slesser, she was killed in June of 1962. Her son still lives here in Boston, obviously a much older man now. I think he was a doctor. And we got his number, and I had to make that call. I didn't want to make that call. Can you imagine? His mother was murdered.
But didn't you think he had done it too?
Yeah, and there was earlier on, there was some talk about whether he might have been, connected to her murder. So I made the call, and an older woman answered, like this Eastern European accent, and I explained why I was calling. I guess it was his wife. And she was like, "Oh my God, why are you calling?" Just like, I was awful. She's like, why are you bringing this to our family? I get the pain. And I was just, this is like the worst job, I hated it. So obviously we were not going to be able to use her son, Anna Slesser's son, Joris, in the podcast. We were able to find some archival audio of him there was a lot of archival audio in the podcast, if you listen to it, from 1962, and he described finding his mother's body. So with her, we were able to use him to kind of help us tell the story of Anna Slesser's. We used archival audio. With this clip, the first clip that we're going to play, this is Ida Urga. She was the 4th victim. She was 75 years old, and she was killed in August of 1962. And we found her grandson, but he didn't want to talk. And he said, but I think my sister, her granddaughter, might. And we found this woman named Debbie Amati, who lived in Princeton, New Jersey. Susan really couldn't stand her voice. And I loved it. I love this woman's voice. She sounds like a little girl. It's such a distinctive voice to me that I'm drawn in. And we were able through, so she's just in Princeton, New Jersey, and we get somebody to go there and record her voice. And I was here in the basement of Northern Light, just like in the basement, freezing cold, with like blankets around me to block out the sound, like on the telephone with her, that's how we did it. And getting her to describe her grandmother to me and bring up details that, this is an auditory medium, so you want to conjure up visual images in the listener's mind about who this woman was. And so why don't we play the first clip?
Good afternoon, Portland. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you.
Who was Ida Urga to you?
My grandmother, my father's mother.
This is Debbie Amati. She's a 64-year-old retired librarian. When we spoke recently, she was in her living room. The floors were carpeted. There were a few prop-up TV dinner tables and a lazy boy. I wanted to talk to her about Ida Urga, her grandmother.
Well, she looks the way you think a grandmother should look, gray hair, dressed conservatively. When she came to visit us, she always tended to wear long skirts.
How would you describe her? Like, what kind of a person was she?
She's definitely a person with fortitude. I mean, you'd have to be to leave your home country with your 2-year-old son. That had to be scary. So she had to be. I say I have to use the word brave to describe her.
Ida Urga was born in 1888 and emigrated to the U.S., settling in Boston in the 1920s. What country was she from?
This is Russia. Technically, it was Ukraine. They lived in a town called Polona, which was near, I believe, Odessa.
World War I was responsible for over 17 million deaths. And from 1914 to 1918, the western part of the Ukraine, where Ida Urga lived, was caught in the geographical crossfire between Russia and Austro-Hungary. Then as World War I ended, a brutal civil war broke out in the Ukraine. For the better part of a decade, Ida Urga had lived in the center of a war-torn country. Sometime during the Civil War, she got married and became pregnant, but her husband died of typhus before the baby was born. And then in the spring of 1922,
when my father was 2 years old, 4 of them got passage on a ship to the New World. And in their party was my father, my grandmother, my father's grandmother, and his Aunt Rania, or Ronnie as we called her.
They arrived at Ellis Island, then headed north to join Ida's brother in Boston, where Ida Urga found work in a factory.
A chocolate factory, and my father told me the story, So she'd pick up the chocolate, put one in the conveyor belt now and then, put one in her mouth.
Just like I Love Lucy.
Yeah, kind of like that, and...
Ida's son Joseph earned a PhD from MIT, and in 1952, Debbie was born, Ida's first grandchild. Today, Debbie fondly recalls her grandma babysitting her, feeding pigeons on the rooftop of her Beacon Hill apartment building. The two of them were close.
One time, I hid her false teeth.
You hid her false teeth?
I hid her false teeth because I thought they were just plain hilarious.
And where did you hide them?
I hid them in the bathroom upstairs, this place on the shelf. So I made a big show, hey, I found them.
And how did she react?
She kissed me. She's happy to get them back.
That visit happened in 1962, and while she was there, Ida talked to her son about the Boston Strangler murders.
She told my father, old women had been murdered in Boston, and my father didn't really, didn't pay too much attention to that, because he knew she was a very cautious person, and she wouldn't let a stranger into the house, and she knew there was a danger out there, and she was very wary.
On Sunday, August 19th, 1962, Ida met a friend on the Boston Common.
Sunday afternoon, she liked to take walks in Boston. She'd get all dressed up, dress, girdle, etc., the whole works. She said to me, "I look good."
The next day, she planned to visit her sister, Ronnie, the same sister she'd emigrated with to the US. But Ida never made it to Ronnie's. Do you remember how you found out that she had died?
Yes, we were supposed to go into the city. We had tickets to see a movie. Well, the day before we were supposed to go was when my father got the call that his mother was dead.
That's it. So there are things that I could say about it, but actually as I was listening to it, I was thinking, I'm curious when you were listening, what parts of it sort of made you go, like pulled you in? Nothing.
And
Nothing pulled you in.
And did you like the voice? So how many people liked the voice? And how many people didn't like the voice?
Oh, Debbie's voice. I thought you meant my voice.
And how many people like Portland's voice? Joey knows for Portland.
Wait. Actually, go back. How many people liked Debbie's voice? And how many people didn't like it? Yeah, just, you found it sort of like annoying.
A little grating, strained.
There is something, yeah, but it's so unusual. I found her captivating. So were there any parts that sort of like stuck out for you, or I can tell you little things about why we produced it the way we did?
Chocolate.
Yeah, who said that?
I did.
Oh yeah, exactly. So that was that reference of, she worked in a chocolate factory. Like when she said that and I was on the phone with her, I said, "Oh, I Live Lucy." Like just saying that, it conjures up an image, right? You just imagine her on the conveyor belt. And I worked in television for almost 20 years before I did this podcast, and I just didn't recognize the extent to which in a medium like this, that's an auditory medium, that you really have to work in the writing to keep conjuring up these images in the listeners' minds, because you don't have a picture, right? So when we first started, the clip started with, Debbie was in her living room, carpeted floors, prop-up TV dinner tables, and a lazy boy. Now, I wasn't there.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. You were huddled under the blanket.
Right, so we got the tape sync person in Princeton, New Jersey to tell us, what did her living room look like, just so we could conjure up that image. And then obviously I got her to describe her grandmother, gray hair, dressed conservatively, long skirt, so you start to see something in your mind. And then we got her to tell the story of how her grandmother had emigrated over from the Ukraine. And that was great for John Delore, for the sound designer, because he could create this whole world of the coming over on the ship and landing at Ellis Island and that sort of old time music. Like he loved that section.
The baby crying.
The baby crying, yeah. Okay, you mentioned the chocolate, thank you for that, Alex. And then the anecdote about the false teeth. She said, "I hid her false teeth." Now, our editor was like, "Oh, I don't think we need that." And I was like, I love that. That's so human. Like here's this little girl, and she hid her grandmother's false teeth. And when I said something that I asked her, right? I said, did you find them or something like that? Or what did you do when you found them, or when your grandmother found them? And she said she kissed me or something. There was just something sweet to me, precious about it. It starts to make this woman who was murdered in this heinous way really human and more relatable.
Can I just say,
yeah.
You also have to hear this in the context of the entire show, because we have been hearing murder number 1, murder number 2, murder number 3, and you're trying to bring people to life who have nothing on them. All there were photographs in the paper, one photo for each victim, and they used the same one over and over. That's all we had for an image when we were making the film. So by the time we got to this whole Ukrainian thing, it was just such a relief. It was like, oh, this is really different. And it's like you said, we need the podcast people for that, because we would not have thought of that. That's something that they're really great at, is appreciating how much we need a break and describing, something different about her. She's from Ukraine, that set her apart.
Yeah, and then there was that other thing where how she liked to dress up on Sundays and go to the Boston Common. And she said to me, "I look good." It was just I just love those moments. It just made her so human, Yeah, okay, so that's it. And then we say that she never made it to her sister. She was supposed to meet her sister that day, but she never made it to Ronnie's. We didn't describe the death there because we all sort of know what happened. This woman was like, it was unbelievable what happened to her at the end of her life, the way that she was found and stuff, just,
But wasn't Portland great? Isn't she great? She's so great, because she's really...
This is why I work with this.
She's got the greatest voice, and she's very journalistic, and it's not an annoying, really high-pitched woman's voice. It's like this nice, low, great voice. But then her laugh is so out of the blue. You get this wild laugh out of Portland. It's so contagious.
Yeah, but that didn't come up a lot in the podcast, so.
Well, I kept cutting out Portland's laugh, but we have another podcast we're going to do, which is going to laugh. We'll tell you about that at the end.
Okay, so, I just want to check on the time, so we're doing okay, right? Yeah. So, next clip is about another victim. They're not all the clips are about the victims, but I wanted to give one more. So this is about Sophie Clark, and she was the 6th victim. She was the first young victim of the Boston Strangler. So the first five victims were older white women. The 6th victim was a young African-American woman. And it was so confusing for the police, like, why would a serial killer who's killed all these older white women all of a sudden kill a young African-American woman? Like, is this a different killer, right? That's kind of the question that it brought up. So again, we're trying to find someone who can describe what Sophie Clark was like. We couldn't find anybody, but what we had was this letter that Sophie Clark had been writing in her apartment in Boston shortly before she was murdered, really right as she was writing the letter, and apparently there was a knock on the door, and whoever it was is the person who killed her. So this was the last letter that she was writing to her fiancé right before she was murdered. Oh, December 5th, 1962. I did want to say something. We got an actor to read this letter, and that's how we tried to bring her to life. Thanks, Alex. December 5th, 1962. My dearest Chuck.
December 5th, 1962. My dearest Chuck. May this letter find the man I love well. How is that cold? I feel fine, especially after you called me last night. You're the kind of medicine I need. You can make a person...
One afternoon in December 1962, Sophie Clark was in her apartment on Huntington Avenue, a busy commercial street in Boston's Back Bay. As the rain fell outside, she sat at her desk, writing a letter to her fiancé, Chuck, who lived back home in New Jersey. He would be visiting the following week.
Today is a nasty day. I do hope the weather is better next week for our sakes. I hope it won't be too late when you get here. I know it depends on when you finish work, but you know I'll be sitting here waiting. I fell asleep last night playing an album by the Flamingos. Audrey just called from work.
Sophie Clark was a 20-year-old student at the Carnegie Institute of Medical Technology. She was a conscientious young woman who always headed home after school to study.
I'll start my homework when I finish this letter, then I'll shift over to the kitchen and cook supper. We're going to have liver tonight, cooked in onions and gravy along with mashed potatoes and the vegetable, I guess. Maybe this weekend I'll get around to...
In the letter, Sophie wrote about what she was going to have for dinner, how she was going to spend that evening. It's the kind of stuff a young couple would text about today.
When is your friend Landy going to move in with you? I'll be glad for you because then you'll not have so many expenses. I was going to suggest that you get a phone, but I guess you can do without it.
That's where Sophie's letter was cut short. At the end of the page, she began a new sentence with the word I. Below that, the page was left blank.
It was a habit of mine every day to call Sophie between the hour of 4 and 4:30. And this particular day, when I called Sophie at 4:15, she didn't answer. And I just felt funny. So then
Sophie's roommate, Gloria Todd, had called home from work. In this 1963 television interview, she's wearing cat glasses, a white sweater set, and a string of pearls.
So then I tried to call her again at 4:30. Still, there wasn't any answer.
Gloria got home around 5:30 and knocked on the door.
I said, Sophie, it's Glo. I said, open the door. and she still didn't answer. So then when I turned the key and I opened the door, I found Sophie lying sprawled out on our living room floor, motionless. She just didn't move. And I was really panicked and shocked, and I called out her name and I said, "Oh God." And then I thought, well, what was I going to tell her mother? Because when Sophie came to stay with us, the last phrase I said to her mother at the time was, "Don't worry, I'll take care of Sophie, and I'll make sure that she writes. So don't worry about her."
Oh, here's a copy of Sophie Clark's autopsy report. There's more. Does it keep, did you cut it off? Hold on. Technical. White cloth was a nylon stocking ligature.
I said, "Sophie, it's Glow." I said, "Open the door." And she still didn't answer. So then when I turned the key and I opened the door, I found Sophie lying sprawled out on our living room floor, motionless. She just didn't move. And I was really panicked and shocked, and I called out her name and I said, "Oh God." And then I thought, well, what was I going to tell her mother? Because when Sophie came to stay with us, the last phrase I said to her mother at the time was, "Don't worry, I'll take care of Sophie, and I'll make sure that she writes. So don't worry about her."
Oh, here's a copy of Sophie Clark's autopsy report. The body was in a supine position, dressed in a garter belt and stockings with a white cloth about the neck, which appeared to be a petticoat or half slip. Beneath this white cloth was a nylon stocking ligature, very tightly constricting the neck. On the feet were a pair of loafer shoes with corrugated rubber soles. Sophie was wearing a blue housecoat, and it was flung open. She'd been sexually assaulted.
Only 2 weeks before her December 5th death in a fourth-floor apartment at 315 Huntington Avenue, Back Bay, Sophie Clark, while on a Thanksgiving visit to her New Jersey home, confided to her father the great fear she had for her own safety in view of the rash of stranglings in Boston.
This is from an article by Loretta McLaughlin, the young reporter covering the case in 1962. She interviewed Sophie's family and friends for this story in the Record American.
Her fear had been so overwhelming in the late summer just before she was to return to the medical technology school she attended in Beacon Hill. Sophie asked her mother if she could transfer to a similar school in New York. A mile away.
For Sophie Clark, her worst fears came true that cold December day in 1962. I just think that's so, like, the sound design, I think that's so beautiful. I just the sound of the rain and that music, the sound of her writing that letter, and I love that. It's like, that's one of my favorite parts, actually, that letter. So there are things that I could say, but I wondered, like, does anybody have a question, actually? I feel like if you want to ask a question, yeah.
That moment when the letter, she stops writing the letter and there's a long pause, we know what's gonna happen. Was that a choice by the podcast producer, or the editors to leave that long pause there? Because it had a great moment.
You mean after she says
The I, and it just rained.
That's sound design, yeah.
Yeah, that sounded great.
The Reverend John DeLore. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Did you get Loretta McLaughlin to record that reading?
Loretta McLaughlin is in her 80s and she's still alive, but no, because she's older now. And we did interview her for the podcast and she definitely was in it. But those articles that were written by Loretta in the 1960s, we found actors to do that. So that was an actress who lives in Rhode Island, actually. So do you know Ren Ross? Some of you know her here. She's a voiceover teacher And I know her because I had taken some classes with her, so I would reach out to her and say, do you know anybody locally? And then sometimes Sharon and John in New York, who were also producing on it, would find actors, and we paid them very short money. Sometimes it was like $50 or something, $75, maybe $100 sometimes if they, this woman probably did the most, Loretta, because there were lots of newspaper articles. And so she just read a whole bunch of them in a session one day.
There were two things that I thought of in that. Two
Yeah.
other things that made this really great was we had a collection called the Ransom Collection, which was in a library in Texas of all the audio, and it came from Gerald Frank's book, right?
Right, so when Gerald Frank was writing the book, The Boston Strangler, in the 1960s, he was recording his interviews with all of the key players, and we had access to all of that audio.
So that we had found making the film and had said to ourselves, this would make a great podcast, I remember at the time. So we could bring people from the 60s back to life. The other thing was that it was an open case, the Boston Strangler, because they never solved it. Albert DeSalvo was never formally charged with the killings. And so we couldn't get access to any of the police files. So we had to find somebody who had all the police files, and I can't tell you who that is or I'll have to kill you. But we had, so we could describe exactly what was going on with Sophie Clark from the police files because we had gotten them.
And there was that interview that we included in this clip. It said, 1963 interview with Gloria Todd, Sophie Clark's roommate, and she describes what it was like to call her and how she went home that day and found her body. And here's another example of my having worked in television for a while. And so, like I said, I would write the first draft of the script, and I think I had just written something like, Sophie's roommate, Gloria Todd, came home from work. Here she is speaking that day in a 1963 television interview. And when I was working with Sharon and John, who are much, more steeped in podcasting than I am, they said, did you see that interview? Did you watch it? And I said, yeah. And they said, what was she wearing? And it's just so funny, like I never would have thought of that. What was she wearing? And I said, well, she was wearing a white sweater set and pearls and cat glasses. They were like, cat glasses, great, put that in. Like that to them was like, that brings you like back to the time. Somebody's wearing cat glasses, So anything to like conjure up those images. And what else did I want to mention? And then with Loretta McLaughlin, the reporter for the Record American, she had written all of these articles about the case, and she had written about Sophie's fear of the Strangler. And we reread through all of those articles, trying to like comb for anything. And it was just really interesting that Sophie was so frightened of being murdered by the Boston Strangler that around Thanksgiving she said to her father that she wanted to be transferred to a different school in New York. And it's just striking because at that time, no young women had been killed, only older women had been killed. And here was this young girl who was so frightened of the Strangler that she wanted to be transferred. So that just seems kind of amazing to us, so we included that in the story. It's always a juggling act, like what do you include? And what do you not include? One thing we didn't include with the autopsy report was that she had been found with her underwear stuffed in her mouth. And we just thought, and I looking at the autopsy report, had like written that in, and Sharon and John were like, that's in bad taste, let's not do that. So sometimes you have to make those calls, like there's so much more that we could have included, and there's so many things that we didn't include, and sometimes you don't include things for just that reason. It's like not in good taste, All right, yes?
How did you choose the actress who read Sophie's letter? And was Sophie originally, or was her family from the South?
See, that's an interesting question that you brought that up, so I'm glad that you mentioned it. And some people have expressed criticism around that. I really like the sound of her voice, and you're right, she does sound like she's from the South, but Sophie Clark was from New Jersey. So we just liked her. Do you know what I mean? Like we had different actresses read, and there was just something, this woman was just, we felt like she kind of just embodied this young woman who was in love and writing to her boyfriend or fiance at home, and we just liked the sound of her voice. And maybe that was a mistake. I don't know. But that's like that's a judgment call. That's a taste. Like she was better than the other actresses who maybe sounded like they were from New Jersey. Do you know what I mean? Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Can I ask, was she also African American?
Yes. Mm-hmm. We looked for African American women. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So can I return to the topic of how great you are before we go on to listen to any more? Portland hates this topic. So at a certain, I think it was episode number 10, we were rushing to get through these, and the Reverend, Portland wasn't available, so the Reverend read instead of Portland the voice.
I mean, he read my part. He read my
He was the
narration.
narrator. He read, he was going to do it when she got back from wherever you were. And it was terrible. And that's when we all realized how great Portland was. And I said to her, Portland, first of all, she doesn't one read. She sits down and does it in one read, which is wonderful when you're in that kind of a rush. Can you imagine? It's 4 o'clock in the morning, everybody wants to go home, and they're on their 10th read of the first paragraph. That never happened with Portland. So I said to her, okay, so how do you do it? Like, you are so much better than John Ballore. How do you do it? And she had an answer. So this is the answer.
I hope I'm remembering what you're getting at. I don't know. I mean, I went to acting school. That probably helps. That's somewhere like in my bones maybe. But one thing I do when I'm doing a voiceover or certainly when I was doing this, and I mentioned this the other day when I was at a podcasting conference, I really try to focus on what I'm saying. It's about paying attention, and it's about being mindful. And it's not like, oh God, I'm hungry, or I just want to get out of here, or thinking about other things. I really try to just be like, okay, for example, I don't know where it is here, but Anna Slessors. So I try to imagine her in my mind, who was murdered in 1962. Like, I think about what I'm saying, and I find that when you think about what you're saying, it's better than when you're like off somewhere else. I mean, is that what you're getting at?
That's it.
It's about mindfulness. It's about mindfulness.
It works.
Yeah.
So do that when you do hosting a podcast.
Yeah. Okay, so next clip. I'm always like really aware of time. Okay, next clip.
Are they all this long?
Yes, Susan, they are.
Is the length okay for everybody?
Yeah.
You can concentrate? Yeah.
These were clips. I'm being a little bit lazy. I chose these clips. I taught a podcasting class at UMass Lowell, and these were the 4 clips that I chose. So I just was like, I'm just going to pull them for tonight because I know these clips. So sorry if they're long. So the whole podcast is not obviously just about the women who died. We also wanted to talk about who might have killed these women, and we focused in a large way on Albert DeSalvo, and also on some of the other killers. And as Susan mentioned, he was never tried. He was never convicted for any of these crimes. But he was tried, and he was convicted for a series of rapes and sexual assaults called the Green Man crimes. And he did go to prison for those crimes. And very shortly after he was convicted and went to prison, he escaped. And we had an opportunity in this clip to tell the story of the day that he was captured in Lynn, Massachusetts.
Food and left.
Albert DeSalvo was hiding in Lynn, about 10 miles north of the city. The Strangler's second victim, Helen Blake, was from Lynn.
Then I went into another house where a couple was watching TV. And I sneaked into the cellar and stayed there.
DeSalvo made a bed in the cellar, and he listened to news about himself on the radio.
Are you confident that you're going to have him back in custody within a very short time?
Well, at this point, what time is it? It's 2 o'clock in the morning. I'll tell you right now, I'm so tired. I'm not confident of anything. All I can assure you is we're giving it 100% maximum effort.
That night, DeSalvo's fellow escapees were caught and taken back to Bridgewater. But DeSalvo remained free.
Somebody put a price on his head, dead or alive.
The Record American newspaper had offered a $5,000 reward. Bailey was worried about vigilantes, so he doubled the amount, with a key condition.
F. Lee Bailey said Friday night he is offering a $10,000 reward for the capture, alive, of self-proclaimed Boston Strangler Albert DeSalvo. Bailey, a well-known defense lawyer who had DeSalvo as a client, expressed fear that, quote, some trigger-happy citizen may shoot him down.
DeSalvo was getting anxious about the same thing, and he knew the police were closing in. He left his hiding spot in the cellar.
Good afternoon, Simon June Farms. How can I help you? Is it possible to speak to Al? Sure, do you mind holding? Thanks.
Hello.
Hi there, is this Al?
Yes.
Al Simon's family has owned and operated Simon's Uniform Store since 1885. The store sells police, postal, and fire uniforms. Al Simon's was 34 in 1967.
It was February 25th, and I know the temperature was in the teens. It was bitterly cold. There was very few customers at all. And he walked in and went up to my father, who was sitting down, and asked my father to use the telephone, and my father said, if it's a local call, okay. And he then said, it's an emergency, I want to call F. Lee.
And when you heard F. Lee, what did you think?
F. Lee Bailey. I mean, F. Lee Bailey was quite famous.
And you thought, if he's saying F. Lee...
As soon as he said that, we turned around. I mean, his picture was on the, in the front of the newspaper, which was on the counter right there. We had all looked at the newspaper. So, we all saw his picture on the front page of the paper.
While DeSalvo talked to Bailey, Simon sent an employee to the back where there was another phone line. The employee called the police. Simons grabbed a billy club and hid it under his shirt.
That does mean that you had some concern.
No, I wasn't concerned one bit. Some years earlier, I was a military policeman in occupation of Berlin, and I had extensive training with a club, and I remember saying to myself, he's not sticking an nylon stocking around my neck.
Simons offered DeSalvo a cup of coffee, and they got to talking.
And I just sort of remember asking him, did you strangle all those 13 women? And he answered, I honestly don't know. I know I did some of them.
He said, I don't know, but I did some of them?
He answered, yeah,
I honestly don't know, but I know I did some of them.
When the policeman did come running in, and they directed him back towards us, and he asked him, well, what's your name? And he said, Albert DeSalvo. When the policeman turned him around and handcuffed him and took him away.
So, maybe I should just open it up. Does anybody have any questions? Okay.
Do you like DeSalvo's voice?
We found an actor to play him as well.
What did you think about the voice?
Yeah. Good.
Do you know what DeSalvo really sounded like?
Based on the pictures, that's what I would assume. Short.
Is that what he sounded like?
Yeah, he had this crazy high-pitched voice, which was, and then they had the old recordings, so it was even worse. So you kind of don't want to imitate that because you're going to go, people aren't going to believe it's real. It's too weird. But that is really what he sounded like. So it was really hard, I thought, to cast him. I thought this guy did a pretty good, he's believable, right?
Yeah. I thought he was great. I thought he was really, really good. He was actually a good actor too. He was in some play off Broadway, and one of our producers knew about him and he was willing to do it. I guess the one thing I wanted to say about this one was, so there was an opportunity here to tell the story of when DeSalvo went to this uniform store, right? So he escapes and he walks into this uniform store, and what we wanted to do was go up to Lynn, because the store is still there, and actually be with this guy who's like now in his 80s and have him say, I was standing here and DeSalvo was here and he walked in and this is what happened. And he was an older man, and I called him. I was the one who was often trying to set these things up. And he said, no, my wife's really sick and I don't have the energy and the store's really busy and it's not gonna work. And I was like, oh, we really need it. And he said, I said, there's no, like, what if we came on the weekend, or what if we came on the, he didn't want to do it, And he said, I'll do the interview right now. And so I don't know if you know about this, and I don't know a lot about technology, but I use this thing called, did you hear the quality wasn't as good, right? It was sort of staticky, right? So I used Call Recorder. So that's what I did. So that's why the quality isn't as good. And that's why when I was interviewing him, sometimes I would repeat what he said, because I knew that it was going to be staticky. So when he said that DeSalvo said about murdering these women, he asked the question, did you murder these women? And he said, well, I don't know. I know I did some of them. And then I said, he said he did some of them? Like, I did that on purpose because I felt like I wasn't sure how clearly this was going to come out, if that makes any sense. So that was a little handy tool. We use these things sometimes. And I had to get permission to, you had to get permission to interview all these people. And so I interviewed him right away. And then we called back and did the part where I said, "Hi, is this Al?" And he said, "Yes, it's him." We got that later. And the part about, did you hear when we called it the store? Mm-hmm. And I said, "Is this Simon's Uniform Store?" or something like that. And then they put us on hold, that's John DeLore deciding to leave that in, that song, Faith Hill Song, Breathe. Because it just seemed like of all the songs, can you imagine, right? Isn't that amazing? It's a subtle reference.
It was real.
Yeah, that was real, yeah, exactly. Okay.
And
good.
the music was composed by a friend of John's, a woman. Do you know what her name was?
I don't remember.
She was brilliant, and she'd do it really quickly, and it was really creepy and great. Very good music.
So the last clip is, this one needs more setup, and I feel like I want to kind of try and do it quickly. If you listened to the Strangler podcast, in episode 4, there was a woman named Adele Roof. Does anybody remember Adele? She was amazing, and we used her in the last episode. And I feel like I need to set it up really quickly. Do you want to say something?
Can I tell where Adele came from?
Yeah.
So when we did the original documentary film, we had interviewed this guy, this cop,
John DiNatale.
John DiNatale, his father's a big detective from Boston on the case. And then didn't talk to him for a year while we were trying to get the podcast going, and then call him back up to get going, and he said that this woman had called him after the documentary had aired. So there was always a debate about whether Albert DeSalvo did them all, and we had really bought into the conspiracy theorists. We didn't think he had, I was convinced that Charles Terry had done the first 5 and other people had done the rest of them. And so this apartment that Adele used to live in was of one of the victims that we were convinced that was the one you would pull out and go, see, no way, it wasn't Albert DeSalvo, it was her boyfriend or, who had strangled her. And
she was, the 7th victim was Patricia Bissett, and she was found December 31st, 1962. And she was 23 years old. She was the 2nd young victim. She was found after Sophie Clark, and she was having an affair with her married boss, and she was 1 month pregnant. So it seemed like maybe this was a different sort of, maybe her boss killed her and made it look like it was the Boston Strangler.
And who found the body? The boss. And the first thing, the blankets pulled up on the body up to here, and the first thing the boss says is, "Oh my God, she's been strangled," but you couldn't see because the blanket was up to here. So that was proof that it wasn't Albert DeSalvo. Well, so John DiNatale, who believes it was Albert DeSalvo, knows it was Albert DeSalvo. That's what his father believed. He said that he got this phone call after the documentary aired from this woman who said, "I lived in the apartment where Patricia Bissett was killed and moved out a month or something before she was killed, and Albert DeSalvo had come to the apartment when I was there." So it was like, okay, well, coincidence that he showed up twice and happened to kill the 2nd person. So then I said, well, so great, can we get in contact with her? No, she didn't give me your telephone number. So that was it. I thought we would never find her again, and instead,
yeah, we did find her, and
she Facebooked or something.
We got an email address. The email address didn't work. We got the telephone number. Sharon found the telephone number of her ex-husband, and then he gave us her number. But just before we play the clip, I just want to make one thing clear. So this woman, Adele Roof, was living in 1962 in the same apartment that Patricia Bissett lived in later that year in 1962 and was murdered in. And when Adele was living there in the summer of 1962, she was out on the street. If you don't know the story, she was out on the street and she runs into this guy who looks like Albert DeSalvo. We find this out later. And the guy says, that she's just so beautiful, and he wants to, he's a modeling scout, and he wants to measure her because he's got these gowns and she just looked wonderful in them. And he comes to her apartment sometime later, knocks on the door, she foolishly lets him in, and with his hands, no measuring tape, he's trying to measure her. And she gets the idea, because she sees his hands trembling, that wait a minute, I'm not safe here. And she makes up a story, and she says, my roommates are sleeping in the next room, maybe we should go outside. She gets him outside, and a few weeks later, he knocks on her door again. She answers the door, and he's standing outside her door masturbating. And she immediately shut the door. He leaves. She moves out of that apartment. A few months later, Patricia Bissett moves in, and she gets killed in that apartment. After Patricia Bissett is killed, Adele is, the police do find her. They bring her down to the police station. She looks at mugshots They're trying to, because they know about what happened. She never sees the guy, but then she's on the T one night, and she sees the same guy who said he was a modeling scout and came to her apartment and was masturbating in her apartment. She sees him on the T one night masturbating again. And she follows him off the T, and at night with a roommate to try to see what building he's gone into, and she gets the address. It's the middle of the night, it's winter, it's cold. She calls up the police department, and she says, this is who I am, and I've been down at the police station, I've been looking at the mugshots, and I just saw this guy, and this is the one, and the police never follow up on the lead, because they got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of leads. So it sort of begs the question, like, wow, if they had followed up on that lead, might 6 women's lives have been saved? So as we got to the very end of this series, and we're at episode 12, it was like, how do we finish the podcast? And we couldn't, this isn't the kind of podcast where we could prove that it was DeSalvo. We weren't going to be able to get the Attorney General's office to give us more evidence. They say they don't have it. We weren't going to be able to run another DNA test to prove that it was DeSalvo's DNA on another victim. So it was like, well, what do we do? And it's always nice to bookend things. And Adele was in episode 4. And the thought was, and I don't think I was the one who had this thought, it was maybe John DeLore, but it was like, what if we brought her back? She hadn't been back to Boston since 1962. She had such a bad taste in her mouth about this city and everything that had happened here. She left and she never wanted to come back. And we called her up and we said, would you be willing to come back? We'll pay for your trip. And we just want to take you to 515 Park Drive, where you lived. And we didn't know what was going to happen. So she came up here, it was January, and we just got in the car and we drove to 515 Park Drive, and it was John DeLore, who was the sound designer. He came up for this specifically, Sharon, the senior producer, me, and Adele. And we just went there with a microphone up to this building, not knowing what was going to happen.
Gowns that we have.
515 Park Drive is a red brick building, 4 stories tall, built in 1908. It's in good condition. There's a stone crest above the door that says The Royal.
I remember the mail slots being to the right on the wall there, to the right of...
The front door to the building was unlocked, so we crowded inside the vestibule and looked through the second door, which was locked. You feel 100% sure that that was your apartment door?
I'm positive that that was the window to our living room.
Yeah.
Because I had the front apartment and could look out the window and see him sitting out here. Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming that that's the door.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't a BU dormitory the way it is now. It was just an apartment building.
Yeah. Does it take you back, or do you feel like, is it spooky being here? Is it like...
I mean, all I'm seeing is Patricia Bissett being covered up and carried out on a stretcher. That's the image that's coming to my mind, and just this feeling of wow, I was really close to having that happen to me, really close, and I was lucky enough that he knocked on my door. What if he had just come in the way he did supposedly with her?
Hi.
We were hoping
anybody
to
that
see
lives
somebody.
in this apartment right here? I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. The students allowed us to enter. We walked down the short hallway, and suddenly, there we were, at the door to Adele's old apartment.
That does look
I mean,
like an old door.
It looks like a really old door. I don't know if it's from 1963, but it looks pretty old.
I was just wondering if it was solid wood.
And this is where he was standing outside masturbating?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So you opened the door, it had the chain on it, and you could see him through the slit between the door frame and the door?
Yes. There was nothing here. There was no little peephole or... Yeah, I keep wondering what this was. This looks like something different.
Lock.
I mean, I just recall one lock.
Oh my gosh, it's open. At this point, we looked at each other in shock. Adele's old apartment, Patricia Bissett's old apartment, was unlocked. That's a little weird.
Hello? Hello, is anybody there? Hello? This is quite astounding, isn't it?
Astounding.
Astounding.
So it looks like two young women live here. They've got their names on the door on these little cardboard fish, which are kind of cute. And I bet they have absolutely no idea what
I
happened.
feel like leaving them a little note.
You do?
Yeah, I do. Just girls, you should really keep your door locked. Oh.
I handed Adele a pen, and she wrote a note.
I lived in this apartment during the summer of 1962. My name is Adele Roof. I'm in town briefly until tomorrow. I'd like to speak with you about the history of this apartment, and I'd like to take a look at it. Please give me a call, Adele Roof, and then my phone number.
Adele posted the note to the outside of the door. Before we left, I asked Adele what her younger self would think of the life she'd gotten to lead.
I think that the young person would just be so grateful to have had just an extremely ordinary life, but so much gratitude for that opportunity. The simple things, getting married, fighting with a husband, having a child, doing just simple, ordinary things that everybody does over the years. Nothing spectacular, but having had all that precious time. The gift of time is basically what comes to mind. Not that I did anything special, but that I had this opportunity that these other people did not have, these other women. The younger ones, but even the older ones who lost their life, they could have had 20 or 30 more years too. Even 5 days, it doesn't matter. Life was stolen from them.
That woman is great. She's amazing.
Did she ever pick Albert DeSalvo out? Like, if she was trying to picture from, was she able to say, yeah, that was the guy that I saw?
Some years, I don't know, I think this was in the podcast. It's interesting that you're asking that question. Some years after she had left Boston, she was living, I think, back in New York City. Gerald Frank's book had come out about the Boston Strangler, and her mother had sent her a newspaper article with information like about the fact that this book had come out, and she saw the photograph of Albert DeSalvo in the newspaper. And when she saw that photograph, she knew that that was the person who'd been knocking on her door. Yeah. But no, she never saw that photograph, his photograph, in any of the mugshots when she went down to the police department. No.
And the other thing she was doing was when she told him, oh, my roommate's asleep, so let's go out in the hall. Then she went down and sat on the stoop. She was studying psychology, and she wanted to understand this guy, so she went down and sat on the stoop with him and spent time talking to him. I mean, can you imagine?
What I want to say about Adele is, and I don't know if you grasped this in the short little clip that we played, but this woman was podcast gold, I think, because she's the kind of person that, you think, oh, I'm going to interview this person and maybe, we'll throw in a few clips of this woman. When you find somebody that's as good as she is, we ended up doing a large part of episode 4 around her. We ended up making a large part of episode 12 around her because she was so good. Why was she good? Because she's the kind of person, when you ask her a question, she's a writer, first of all, and writers tend to be good with words and good speakers. You ask her a question, she would go, think about it, form her thoughts. She was very reflective. She was very in touch with her emotional life. She was very articulate. She'd done a lot of work on herself, and she was a delight. And I guess what I want to say is, like, when you find somebody like that, like, just grab them. Like, you can make a whole episode with someone, somebody's that good.
Brave.
Yeah.
And the other thing she did was she brought in this whole context of how women were treated in Boston in those days. So out of the blue, for those of you who have heard this, comes a story of how she was walking down the street in Boston with her roommate, and the next thing you know, some BC students gang a guy show up in a car and throw her, I guess the roommate got away or something, threw her into the car, and they're like trying to sexually molest her, and Somehow she gets out and she falls out of the car into the street, and then the cops try and cover it up. So the cops are paying her off when she came in not to testify against these college students. And she, out of the blue, tells a story about sexual harassment in her day that nobody asked her about. It just came out. And that's in the podcast. And that's really powerful in the last episode.
And I wondered if you wanted to say something with that last moment. So there was a part at the end of the clip where I say, I asked Adele what her younger self would think of the life that she had gotten to lead. And that actually was not my question. So John DeLore, who was one of the producers, he asked that question. And there was a whole to-do about whether we should leave his voice in the podcast asking that question or not.
So anybody, what would you have done? So do you have John ask the question because he really did in real life?
Had his voice ever been introduced at any other point in the podcast?
Right, that's a good point.
Yeah,
Not at all.
Very good point.
So he was originally in the last episode asking that question. And Susan was adamant that it should not
let
be.
her answer.
I would claim editorial discretion if having to say, and now we go to Reverend John so-and-so, and he asked this question. If it was really jarring, I might decide that the same person is still asking the question. You were there when the interview happened?
Yeah, I was there.
I think that I would go with whatever the most elegant and graceful solution would be.
Do you want to say what you thought?
Oh, anybody else?
Wait, in the script, do you say I asked the, like, do you say that you asked the question?
Yes, I think I do. I asked Adele what her younger self would think of the life she'd gotten to lead, which is a great question. And it was one that he had come up with. And we first had him in the podcast asking it. Then did we say that maybe we were maybe gonna have Sharon ask the question? And then Susan was like,
Go ahead.
How bad was his voice?
It actually wasn't that good, but it was fine. Yeah, it wasn't about that.
Was there a reason you didn't just say, like, our sound designer asked the question?
Well, okay, so I'll tell you my thoughts on this one. It's been very intimate. It's been Portland through this whole thing. You think Portland's out there alone. You don't imagine in your mind she's out there with a producer and a sound recordist. You know, it's Adele
and I
Portland.
usually wasn't, but for that episode I was.
It's Portland and Adele going to the thing, and you know, it's been Portland's relationship through the whole thing. And in the end, to throw in this guy voice that comes out of nowhere, and then you go, okay, first of all, you don't hear the question because you're going, who's he? And then you go, why is the guy asking this question? He's there with them? Who else is there with them? Has he been there all along? You've now missed 2 minutes of the podcast. And and the other thing was the real producer who was there a lot of the time in recording was Sharon. But Sharon John never came. He just came for the last day. And so he asked the question. And there's this big thing with podcasters that now we get to all introduce ourselves and we're all part of this and everybody gets credit. But I felt like it took us out of the story, you know. So, and then you didn't even need the question. You could have just had the answer, and you know, at some level, I thought we tried it without. It was fine. But anyway, that was where I was coming from. But I was a very unpopular person, for instance, because I couldn't understand that they didn't get that. I was really confused that everybody thought it was okay to have this guy out of nowhere come in and ask.
But you felt, yeah, I think that's the main reason you felt that way. But you also felt that way because you felt like this is a story about women, and then all of a sudden we're going to introduce this guy. Right?
Well, it's like the guy asked the big final question too, just from a sexist point of view. I didn't like that. He's been staring at the whole time. These girls are just playing, but the guy behind it.
She's a tough cookie, and she got her way.
Was there a reason that you took credit for it versus just saying when asked such and such?
Ooh.
When asked is a little third person-ish, though.
But you didn't ask it. And I love your work, I'm just saying that you didn't ask it.
Sometimes you do stuff like that.
No, she doesn't really do that. They made her, I made her do it. I made her do it.
I can see that reverting to the third person ad when it's been an intimate interview style beforehand where everything's in the first person, that could also be a little
weird.
Yeah.
I think you could have just skipped the question and just had her come in with her kind of thoughts about the whole thing. If you needed it.
I had to say, allow me to say, I think you guys are really like focused on. To me, it's a no-brainer that the host, at least when we make television, right? I mean, the idea is that, you know, people are feeding questions to the person on camera all the time. There can't be more than a third, even if the person is real, that you didn't say, well, you know, can we get that in 9 seconds? And maybe you can do it like, hey, how about this word instead of that word? or whatever it may be. I mean, everybody there is influencing what's the production.
Yeah.
And I think it goes without saying that the host is going to remain the host.
Yeah, it's a real team effort.
Mm-hmm.
But that team doesn't talk, Portland does.
Yeah.
That's what she does. But we got great reviews on this, I gotta say, because these days you get constant feedback, and we didn't get really, the only thing I read, and I read hundreds of these, was too bad. It was a site where it's solving mysteries, too bad we couldn't solve this one at the end.
But you can't, you just can't.
Yeah.
Did she have any thoughts on the police not following up on her lead when she tracked the guy to the building and had an address for where he had gone and actually knew his location at that given time?
She said she just got kind of like, by that point she was a little disgusted, I think, with the Boston Police Department. She had gone down to the station many times. She'd been called many times to look at mugshots. And she felt like, look, she said this to me, and I don't remember if this is all in the podcast or not, but she said, I was on the train, in the middle of winter, it's cold, it's dark. In some ways, I kind of risked my life following this crazy man to see where he went into a building. I went to a payphone, I called the Boston police immediately to give them this information, and they didn't follow up on it. I think at the end, she sort of felt like, ugh, screw you, But then you're like, what if you'd what if you'd kept pursuing it, would they then have followed up on it, and would these women's lives have been saved? It's hard to know, but she felt like it wasn't her responsibility. Like she did everything that she could have done. Yeah.
That's I was going somewhere with that. I just remembered. So there was a podcast afterwards about the Boston Strangler, and all these podcast experts are debating the whole Strangler, if they liked it, did too much sound about the design, how did they feel about it. And the big question came down to whether Portland was real or not. Was she a producer and really producing and asking questions, or was she just a voice reading the script?
That kind of pissed me off. Well, because I probably worked like 80 hours a week sometimes.
Well, they came to the conclusion, I think there were people really arguing that you were the producer, but tell the end of that story, that you ran into her later, or you interviewed her.
Oh, yeah, I guess the woman, I think it's big deal. The woman who said that she thought that I was just the voice, just talent. When we were trying to get the podcast off the ground, I had actually called her, and she and her husband, I think, have a crime podcast, and I had called her to see if they might be able to help us. And so I let her know I responded, I think, online, and let her know that. And then she recognized, she was a producer, she was contacting me, like she was helping to put this story together. She wasn't just a voice,
And she apologized, Jim.
So, good. So do you have any other questions? And Susan has something that she wants to tell you, like another podcast we're thinking of pitching. But before we go to that, does anybody have any final questions?
How was this structured maybe differently from the documentary, and how did you decide to, there were bits in there that are like, let's talk about how frightened the whole of Boston was about this crime and how women were protecting themselves with like ski poles and like when did you decide to put that in there and figure out kind of the path?
I was counting the documentary. I gotta say, it pretty much paralleled in the end the documentary in a lot of ways, only we didn't have a Dell roof. So the whole last episode was very different. It was a lot longer. We had room for a lot more.
So much more detail.
Detail of it.
You say parallel, though. We didn't have.
Well, you
doubt.
tell the story, the first murders, second murders, and then Natalie Bailey comes in, and there's a whole debate about the whole court choices that they made to not, and it was pretty simple. And then
but Charles Terry
got one episode in the end, even though we'd gone up to Maine and found all this great life. We had this whole live show where Portland's out there. We had a Ouija board session up in Maine where the ghost was naming seriously, we had Brian Kavanaugh, the son of this Kojak guy, up there with her, and it was spelling out who had killed each of the victims. And we had great stuff. We had her walking through a park where one of the victims had been killed in the night and trying, we had really live tape of us going to a high school and finding it, just great stuff.
There's so much stuff that didn't get used, yeah.
And it never got used.
Yeah. The victim, it was not a Boston Strangler victim, but Charles Terry, who was the person who was convicted of killing this woman who was murdered in New York in 1963. The murder was so similar to the Boston Stranglings that this detective Susan's talking about, who the television show Kojak was based on, he always thought that the guy who murdered this woman in New York in 1963 had also murdered the first 5 women in Boston in 1962. And where am I going with that?
I'm not really sure. That's your job to remember, not mine.
Right, there's a reason I was telling that story, though. Oh, I know. So anyway, Charles Terry had murdered a woman in Maine, Shirley Coulin, in 1951. Right. So anyway, I just brought it up because one of the things that I had to do was Shirley Coulin was meeting her husband at the train station one night. She'd written him a letter, and they'd been divorced, and they had a baby that had died, and she wanted him to come the next day, and she was supposed to meet him at the train station, and he doesn't show up, and she's waiting for him at 11 o'clock at night, and then she walks away from the train station down this sort of deserted road, and she gets murdered. And so Sharon's thought, the senior producer, was, well, let's have Portland walk the same walk that Shirley walked that she got murdered.
Let's go at midnight.
So we went there. I'm such as someone in this room knows, I am such a morning person. I'm not a late night person. So we stayed up till 11:30 at night, and we went to the train station, and they all left, Sharon and Southern, and I had to sit there with this recorder and walk the same walk that Shirley Coulin walked, and dictate what was happening. Okay, now I'm walking by the 7-Eleven, and there are a couple of guys on bicycles, and it's dark out, and there's nobody else here, and I'm walking up to the train, and I don't see the train, and
oh shit, that was somebody on a bike. Okay, I'm okay.
Yeah, and I did scream at one point. There was a really good scream because some guys did ride by on bicycles, and I was like, ah! But these are the things that you have to do when you're hosting podcasts.
And here I am again saying, okay, I want to do another podcast and put Charles Terry in because I want to get all this stuff in. But I'm giving up on Charles Terry. You get episode 5, that's it.
So anyway, Susan and I are looking to, can you record this part, Alex? This is the part that we're looking to record.
This is the audience participation part, okay? So you guys are podcast listeners, correct? Yeah. Okay, so we are going to pitch you our next podcast idea. So the truth behind the Boston Strangler is that Portland was not into true crime and murder. She really wanted to do something on women's health, natural health, maybe
wellness, something positive, uplifting.
And I kept saying, come on, if we get through this, you'll be famous, we can do whatever we want.
That's not quite true.
So this is our new podcast idea. So we started out with spiritual health, and then we went in, anyway, I'm not really sure, I'm not going to tell you how we actually came up with this, but I'll tell you, here we go. So the idea is Portland is in episode 12, and she's making, the Strangler, and she's kind of has this revelation, why is it in our culture that we keep telling the stories over and over again of sexually murdered women? And we don't really know about the women, but you know the man, and we're trying to get this thing made, and of course you can sell, women being strangled, 13 of them brutally, but you can never talk about positive sexual experiences. If you talk about something positive, then it ends up in the pornography section, and then it gets X-rated and you can't get it on the air, but somehow killing women and all this, violence and sex is okay. And then she starts thinking, is that what really sex should be about, is violence and sex? And she's remembers this, relationship she had and the moments that she had where this almost as though it was like a blending. Sex was like a spiritual, sort of a oneness with her partner that was so uplifting and enlightening. It was a whole completely different way of looking at it. And that's what we should be striving for, not endless, sexual violence. So anyway, so she's kind of trying to figure out what the next podcast is going to be, and she has this yoga teacher who seems to know everybody in the spiritual community, and so she invites him out to dinner, and she says, okay, I want to do a spiritual podcast, and what should I be doing? And he says, well, you should be doing sex, sex sells, you should do something on sex. She's like, oh, I'm thinking about it, what have you got? And he's like, you should do something on the Tao of sex. And she's like, what is that? And he's like, this is an ancient Chinese practice. So the Chinese were really obsessed, ancient Chinese, 5,000 years ago, were obsessed with longevity. They really were all about figuring out how you live a long, healthy life. And they believe that as you get older, that's the best part of life. Your kids are gone, everything's gone. And if you're healthy, those are the years where everybody respects you and get to do what you want. So they start studying it, and they find out that the thing that gives you more chi or more energy of anything is sex. That sexual energy capable of keeping you young and giving you a long life. And so they start to study it and perfect it, and they study it and perfect it for 5,000 years. And they have this whole practice of how to have really good, healthy sexual life. And they believe that the whole universe is made out of the yin and the yang, that women, it shouldn't be one subordinate and violently, killed in the case of the Boston Strangler, but that there should be a blending of the yin and yang. That's what makes a healthy couple, which makes a healthy family, which makes a healthy society. And because we're so off of that in this country, that's why we're such this is our yoga teachers talking militaristic society. We're really out of balance between the male and the female. So then Portland goes on a quest to find out if there's something to this. So she looks into why is this sex and violence thing. So she goes back and talks to experts and studies. There's all the science on monkeys, and some chimpanzees are really violent, and these other monkeys are really not. It's a whole society that's not, and that there was actually a Radio Lab thing about how these monkeys were socialized into how they behaved. And so there's a little bit of her being the journalist and trying to figure this out, and looking at world, she's like, okay, so what world cultures don't look at sex the way we do in this country? Where is it not so much emphasis put on sexual violence and these kinds of things? And she's living it sort of through her whole personal relationship at the same time, because she has always sort of been seeking that kind of union that she had in her relationship. So Portland then comes in as a real person. And John Dolores got us going to New York City, and it's not saying that one kind of sex is better than another kind, it's just that it's consensual and both people benefit from it. So he's got her going to swingers party with the yoga teacher who's now joined her in her quest, and walking across carpet.
It's hard for me to imagine myself doing that.
Walking across the carpet at the swingers party where there's a bump in the rug, and she finds out that some guy's getting his kicks off because he's under the rug and he likes women walking over him in high heels, which actually happened with John Dolores at some swingers party. So anyway, so then we get into teaching this sort of sexual practice and what it is that the Chinese discovered over 5,000 years, that ultimately Portland has to decide, is she going to practice, is she going to try it herself to find out whether or not there is sexual enlightenment through this thing. And I don't have to describe to you how it works in this, but it's really interesting to hear what the Chinese came up with, which none of us know about. So what do you think? And in the end, she may actually try it. Who knows? We don't know what's going to happen because it's a real life podcast. So what do you think? Would you listen to it? Do you think it's interesting? Do you like the concept?
Yeah.
Something new, right? Putting
It's
out
fresh,
it's a positive sexual thing,
Would you
right?
speak into this microphone when you give feedback?
Oh, go ahead.
No.
You were more articulate. Go for it. Rarely. It's a fresh idea. It's something different. A spin, and also it's a topic no one talks about without feeling embarrassed or getting blushed. And it's nice to hear it talked about openly. Very interesting.
Question?
So in it, do you plan to explore also the asexual, the sexual asexual spectrum versus just focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, it's this whole idea of the melding of the yin and the yang in the relationship, and it doesn't have to be man and woman, it can be anything, but it's this coming together as one. It's sexuality is a spiritual practice, basically.
Right, but she said asexual as opposed to homosexual.
Oh.
Is that what you said, right?
We can talk about that afterwards. I haven't got an answer.
But yes, it could be heterosexual or homosexual.
Other thoughts?
Does anybody hate the idea and wouldn't listen to it?
I'm really sorry.
Sorry. I'm wondering, since this is like a concept coming from Chinese history, are you going to be talking about this? You mentioned New York, and so will this be playing out in New York and Boston, or will you be talking to people who are Chinese, or?
Well, we have two different budgets, and the high budget has us going to China and looking for a Taoist master. The low budget has us maybe going to New York, maybe we go out to California and see if we can find.
Maybe to Chinatown, Boston.
Chinatown. Right. And yes, we would be looking for someone.
And guides
of that
who
culture.
are actually from the culture, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And how would you place yourself as like a white woman going into these spaces?
Mm-hmm. How would I place myself? It's an interesting question. Talk a little bit about, can you just give me a little bit more of an elaboration of what you're getting at with that?
I guess just with the way you're interacting with this history that you might be removed from or not know that much about, how you would be approaching it from your own background and perspectives.
I think open, but also I think I would probably be willing to admit that I don't know if I'm going to be answering your question right now, but one thought that comes up to me is like, how much do I really want to reveal about myself? How personal do I want to be? I certainly would be open to expressing reservations or difficulty or concern or confusion about aspects of their culture. I've been to Asia myself and have taught Asian people actually English. I taught Asians English for 11 years, so I have some familiarity actually with their culture. But I would be very open about my own discomfort, but I don't know how open I want to be about my own personal experiences. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, I would say she'd have to begin sort of before she gets into Asian culture by going to visit Sting, who practices Tantra sex. I think that would be the first place to start. But the other thing is that Portland's realization about this experience that she had is that, oh my God, this person that I had the experience with was practicing the Taoist sex, but didn't know it. I mean, it was just naturally that's what was going on. So there's a little bit of a recognizing what she was after in the culture, but always referring back to her own personal experiences while she's doing that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi. So one of the concerns I have in terms of this project is you're getting to learn about a different tradition and a different culture. And part of this is taking on this responsibility of representing that in a mindful way and a respectful way, and ensuring that this tradition does not get exoticized or continuing this othering that happens quite often in Western realms, which, this goes back to like colonialism, about the way that the West consumes what happens in the East and brings it up in a manner that's, oh, look at the strange things that other people do. And so just curious of how you all will be mindful of that and thinking about that as you're moving forward in this personal journey, but also responsibly and making sure that this way of approaching life gets represented in a responsible manner.
So it's a great question. Thank you. I would say it begins really here. It begins with the yoga teacher who practices this, who is Western. And I mean, the story is that communism sort of stamped it out in Asia, in China, the practice of this. So they don't really practice it really with it, and then it moved here. So we're really going to begin with how it's practiced in this country before we even go over there and find out if it's practiced there anymore and what they know about it. But I mean, it's more, there will be a little bit of a how-to. I mean, the basic, in a nutshell, concept is that the way that we understand sex is wrong. That there's this idea that, if you're having sex, a good sexual experience is for the man to have an orgasm, and that's the woman's job, and then that's pretty much good sexual experience. And they believe that that's bad. The guy falls asleep and he's tired, and the woman's going, and maybe he doesn't want to have anything to do with her, and she's going, is that my fault? And she's not satisfied, and it usually ends up in not a great experience. And what they really worked on was for the man to hold back from having an orgasm and to bring the woman through these 14 stages of orgasm that most women don't know anything about and have never been through. So that's this whole different sort of concept of it's all about the woman and pleasing the woman and getting the woman. So for me, it's very empowering for women that, we're going to take our part in this too. And it's interesting because we have somebody who was really a champion for this and loved it, and he happened to be a man, and he brought it to his team, and he could have actually made this happen. He's very high up somewhere in Portland, I'm not going to tell you where. And it was the women who didn't like the idea. And I'm like, but wait a second, it's all about women having pleasure and sex. What do you mean they don't like, and empowering women? And then we all thought about it and thought, well, maybe it's because it was a man pitching the idea that it wasn't so popular. But it was really the women on the staff who were like, I don't really like this podcast.
But overall, I think that, I think your question is a really fair one, and I think it's important to bring good taste to anything. So I don't think, I would feel uncomfortable if we made it like, ooh, look at all these crazy weird things the ancient Asians used to do. Like, I wouldn't want it to come across like that. Like, treating it with respect and dignity and would be a big part of it.
We've been listening to a bunch of podcasts on sex. Does anybody listen to the podcasts that are out there?
They're so stupid. I mean, I'm not an expert on all of them.
You have to tell us which ones to listen to then, because the ones we've heard are really, we'll talk about it.
I think that's a better one, right? Yeah, that's good. Yeah, but some of them just sound like a couple of girls sitting in their living room just chatting about guys they've been, I mean, it seems so silly to me, like that's not what we would be going for at all.
Yeah, and we're trying to go for sort of a larger concept, it's not just about sex, it's more of sort of a cultural, let's look at how we look at sex kind of thing, but tell it through a personal story.
Anyway, thank you for listening to our ideas. Anything else?
I apologize in advance for my commentary. When I first heard the idea that you guys were going to do something that approached sex and talked about sex in a more positive way, especially given that now I think I've seen so many true crime television shows, documentaries, podcasts that all involve the sexual crime against a young woman who's then murdered. When you mentioned sex, I was thinking like, oh great, this is going to be something that's going to talk about how sex might be oriented in our society, how we think about it in such a way where women can be penalized for it. And then I was thinking like, I don't know that I'm that interested in listening to one woman's journey about looking at this through a different cultural practice and how it's viewed, but I was more interested in thinking about how we've built up all of these ideas throughout so many different periods in history and how and where they did emerge, and whether we have always considered or approached sex in this way within Western society or in other societies, how they might approach sexual violence or other ideas like that. And I think just a big broader look at how we approach all of this throughout any culture or a wide variety of it, not just in Taoist tradition, but also in the corpus of Western traditions and other things. And I think that would be interesting too, because it's a topic that, you're right, it isn't always taken seriously in the media. It can be used in a titillating way or an exploitative way, but not necessarily as a serious topic to look at it as part of people's lives and how we structure and talk about it in a lot of different ways. So I think...
So why are you apologizing for that?
Because I'm not really into the idea of just following one woman's journey.
Well, it's not, and I pitched it wrong, because we have a whole episode first in the United States, what has been sort of the sexual mores loosening and the history in this country, and then we go to Europe, and then we compare it. So we do have a couple of episodes. So there's the science, and then there's a cultural comparison. I mean, Portland really, she's great at this, goes back and forth between being the journalist and trying to look at exactly what you're talking about, and then always comparing it to her own personal experience. I mean, that's why she cares, and that's why she's on the journey. And it's true. I mean, it really is coming from herself, her interest in this topic, which it wasn't on the Boston Strangler.
And is this something we're going to bring other people in to talk about their personal experiences as
Yeah,
well,
because at a certain point when you hear about actually what you have to do, the exercises you have to practice, you have to count how many times, it becomes kind of funny a little bit. So then it's sort of like, really? Do you really practice this? And this is really time consuming, and how much time do you spend doing it? And is this going to really work in Eastern? So there's a level of, okay, now I get it. Let's interview people who practice it.
Yeah. You have one last question.
You can ask as many as you want.
How diverse is the production staff?
How
diverse is the production staff?
We haven't got it together yet. Do you want to work on it?
No, but
we haven't got the staff. We don't have a staff together. All we know is it's really hard to work with everybody in New York City, so we'd like to look for people in Boston this time around.
And we prefer to work with women.
okay, I think that's
all we have time for tonight. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you so much.
I think Susan and Portland are going to be lingering for a few more minutes if you have any one-on-one questions you want to ask them. But thanks for coming out. Have a safe trip home.
No, it's a worse than terrible. Come on.